eventually a lot of this work that I was doing here in South Africa turned into a PhD thesis at the University of Cape Town. But across 120 pages, if I could summarize my PhD in one sentence, it's shut up and listen.
Welcome back to the Designer Will See You Now podcast, where we talk health, advocacy, and design. And Bella, I have a question for you today. Has any design, good or bad, touched your life in some way since the last episode?
Yeah, I was recently at a design conference called OFFF with 3 Fs. I always try to, for some reason, pronounce the extra F. Like it's supposed to off. But OFFF, this was my second time going to this conference, and they have it at different locations around the world, actually. Like the big one is in Barcelona, and this was I believe it was their 20th or 25th year holding this conference. And the first one I went to was in Sevilla, so but they have it in Mexico City. They have it in I think some other places as well in Canada. I think they're doing one this year, but it's different. So it's nice that there's like some satellite ones, and then there's a main one. So that was my, and it's like it's a design conference in that it's more like the focus is really like typography, branding. It's not a lot of UX or UI, which I find really refreshing because I feel like we're bombarded by that stuff all the time anyway through work. So it's nice to look at other fields and how their processes work. And I especially liked, maybe this is the first time I'm telling you about this too, but I especially like to talk about a company working with AI, but in a way that I really respected, because they touched on, I think it's a Barcelona-based company called Domestic Data Streamers, and
yeah, you did tell
me. Have I told you about this?
Yeah.
So they they were like, hey, like, how come the government is the only entity that gets to like use all this AI to like spy on us or like conduct surveillance on like its citizens? Like, that's not fair. So they came up with the idea that because a lot of like parliament sessions are recorded or live streamed even and open to the public, they were like, let's train an AI model to identify when a member of parliament is like on their phone. And then they were like, but wait, that doesn't really work because you could technically be working on your phone too during a session. So we can't really call people out for like using their phone a bunch. But we can call people out for falling asleep and being asleep on the job. So they trained a model to identify if a member of parliament had fallen asleep, and it automatically tweeted and like tagged them if it detected somebody sleeping during a session. And the tweet would be like, hey, parliament member so-and-so, like your company, or yeah, you're not your company, your country really needs you. You should probably wake up. Like, which I was like, this is genius. This is what we should be using AI for. And just their like approach to AI being something that can like easily, sadly, be used to just crack down on like already marginalized communities. Like they were seeing it used by like big store chains for like identifying pickpocketing, or not pickpocketing, what is it called? Shoplifting, I mean.
Shoplifting.
And they were like, wait, but like all this is doing is just identifying like people that are living like under the poverty line. Like that's really messed up. So I just really like the way they were like using AI for good in a bunch of different ways. So I would definitely check them out. They're a really cool company. And check out OFFF. It's always fun to go to those.
Yeah, I think the next one is you were saying in Mexico City, right? I
Yeah.
think in August. No, but I love that. I love how creative that is because it's like it's one of those things. It's like, damn, you wish you had thought of it yourself because
Yeah.
it's relatively simple, right? Like training an AI just to recognize when someone's falling asleep, but it's such an effective way of like what's the word like not having an impact, but such an effective way of keeping of getting involved kind of in government in a way that we haven't seen before. You know what I
Definitely.
mean?
Yeah.
And also it's like who watches those parliamentary proceedings?
Exactly.
No one, you
Nobody.
know? Like, and that's exactly what like AI should be used for. It's the stuff that, you know, people really shouldn't have to like do any sort of busy work or anything like that. Plus, on top of that, actually keeping leaders accountable is such a I don't know, it's such a genius solution. So I loved when you told me about that. Yeah, it's really cool.
So before we begin, I just want to do corrections. I just want to before we begin, I just want to make
Next episode, you're correcting this part.
Damn it.
You're like, I would like to correct when I said do corrections. I meant
because I speak English and that wasn't that. So before we begin, I just want to correct some things I said from the first episode. Already getting in there, but in the spirit of just like keeping things factual. I think I mentioned that we have one regulatory person at Asthma Tuner, and that's not true. We actually have two people. I think of the other one more as a bit of a project manager because that's who that person is to me. So, but just that little detail. And then secondly, I mispronounced Celine Seman's name. It should be Seman and not Seman. So just wanted to, yeah, make those little corrections.
So I'll go ahead and start off by saying that this is a really big milestone for us because it's our first guest episode. So no pressure, Jared, but I think you're an awesome first guest to have. And the person we have is Dr. Jared's son. And I know Jared from earlier through my boyfriend George and your friend. And we actually originally met in Tulum, ironically, but since then have traveled around a bit together, including to South Africa, where Jared does a lot of his work. And this is actually Bella's first time meeting Jared. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation about Jared's work. And Jared originally is a Stanford-educated ER doctor who works part-time in LA and part-time in Cape Town, South Africa. And his work there has been around helping under-resourced communities to build a more effective ER system, which is tailored to local needs. And over the 10 years that he's worked in the Western Cape, he has helped to train over 10,000 first responders across 100 communities, which is incredible. And so I'm kind of want to pass the baton off, Jared, to you and kind of hear more about what brought you to actually work in South Africa.
Yeah, it was actually quite circumstance. I totally didn't even expect to go to South Africa, let alone that, end up spending the next 10, 15 plus years doing healthcare work there. I originally went there as like as an exchange student during college, and by the time I got there, I had already thought of had an interest in emergency care work. I was EMT certified. I was helping out with ambulance training at my college, and was thinking of future of going to medical school. Um, when I got to South Africa, the just kind of walking around and meeting people, they take us on tours into the Cape Flats or the townships, which are known for very high crime violence rates, poverty, lack of education, low resources. And, given my background, I just was having casual conversations with individuals that were living in that area. And, you know, was hearing from them that, they have like this really bad combination of high crime violence, heavy medical burden, uh, but the emergency services were very heavily overstretched. And you can imagine for millions of the population that live in poverty that have such, high trauma rates and medical emergencies, uh, there weren't enough ambulance services to go around and get them to the hospital in time. And so it was through that I decided, I wanted to try and do something. I was very inexperienced. I didn't know the people. I didn't know South Africa really more than, what I was learning in my classes. I definitely was by no, stretch, even today, would call myself South African or African. Um, but I wanted to do something. I wanted to at least give it a try. And so that was kind of the start of, for lack of knowing what else to do, I just started asking around people like, what would be helpful uh, to address your problems. And that's when people there mentioned like, hey, when emergencies happen, the only people that are around are local neighbors. So why don't you teach us maybe basic first aid to help, so we can at least help the people until ambulances arrive or until we're able to get them to the hospital. And so that's kind of how it all started.
Yeah, it's great that like you had an opportunity to kind of see what was needed there. And I think your approach of asking, what the people needed and how you can help was kind of a great way to approach and just offer up your skills. And I know that Bella, you had a question around like when it comes to helping people, in townships like that versus in LA, like, how does that compare?
Right, exactly. Like what was your like how are you going from LA and then into this new environment, and can you compare and contrast those a bit for us, like a day at work in LA versus a day of work in South Africa?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my approach in South Africa from the very beginning, what I was really scared when I started my work in Manenberg. That's the first township that we started this community response system. Uh, and I didn't know at the time that there was kind of a movement within the greater global health field where, originally decades ago, people were kind of like, very paternalistic. People from America or Europe would go into developing countries and just kind of tell people what they should be doing. I mean, now it's pretty obviously we're all on the same page. That's not a really good way to do things. Back then, I think people were kind of slowly realizing more and more that you need to be respectful of what goes on in local context. Uh, and on top of that, too, it's not even just like out of respect. It's just like what's actually plausible. What works in Sweden is not going to work in South Africa, right? And so, the people that know best what is how things work are the people who actually live and breathe it on a day-to-day basis. So this was something that was already going on in the background. But at the time when I first landed in South Africa, I was probably 18 or 19 years old. And to me, from my perspective, I wanted to do something. I wanted to help however I could, but I recognized that I was young, I was stupid, I was foreign. I just didn't know what could be done or what needed to be done. And so that led me to really naturally humble myself, like aggressively, and go to local people, when I would say like, hey, I want to help, but I don't know how. Here's some skills that I have. Here's some resources that I have access to. But I don't, I really don't know what's the best approach going forward. And so I was really asking the people in front of me, the people actually living in these impoverished communities, what can I do to help you? And I was very fortunate to meet people that had an opinion and were very comfortable speaking with me to tell me, like, this is what we want, this is what we need. And then it was, it was a collaborative experience from there to try and set up something that worked for the local people.
I love
So
how you're touching on that so much that like that first of all the term that you use, like aggressive, humbling yourself aggressively. I think that's like something everybody should do going into a project, right? Like that's what should happen, that you just listen, kind of like Ola, the design philosophy you mentioned in our first episode, that you just like go into it and you listen to what's around you, because you can't go into it knowing or thinking that you know everything. um
yeah, I mean, you can't. Yeah, and it's like I didn't know anything. Just to be completely frank and honest, and I found out later that what we ended up doing was is trying to set up a community response system where when an emergency strikes, there is an integrated layer of the neighbors and residents and community members who can actually help and assist the emergency and also help other emergency services to do their job even better. Uh, I didn't realize, until later. I mean, it was obvious when I started, but I didn't realize how much later on that there were a lot of other people that were attempting or had attempted to do something similar, uh, but it didn't get the same momentum that we were blessed with. And if I were to do a post-mortem into, like, what happened with other people, it's the difference was that we were the most aggressive in that, asking people like, hey, this is your community, this is your system. We're here to help just set up the structure and hand over the keys. And, this was, in contrast to, some other examples that we would see, for example, like such as, other people came in and were doing first aid training. It's not like groundbreaking. It's like a pretty common concept. But I was finding instances where people were training local community members how to use an AED, for example. That's like the automatic external defibrillator to use when people are in cardiac arrest. That's like standard basic life support, CPR kind of training. But then it's like, where are people going to get an AED
right.
in a place that doesn't even have paved roads, right? So it's like they totally did not match what was going on with the actual local situation.
Yeah, when you brought up that you were in some ways blessed to be collaborating with local people and kind of community representatives who were so willing to give their input, I wanted to ask, was that just a coincidence that in those communities there happened to be those types of leaders, or was it something that you were also doing that kind of helped foster that collaboration? And I guess that's what you're kind of getting at with that kind of more aggressive, like, no, we really need to hear from you kind of approach.
Yeah, there was a lot of luck, a lot of luck. The situation and the opportunity just happened to present itself. Going a little bit back into South Africa's history, was the victim of apartheid, where you had like race classifications and oppression of certain races against others. And in these impoverished communities, it's mostly black. The races are black or colored. Colored is its own race classification in South Africa, and there is like an element of other races, being the oppressors, and there's a distrust coming from people within South Africa. And then on top of that too, there's like a historic, like, we're the ones in power. We're, charged with managing everyone else. We're gonna help provide provide for them and develop these services. And so that was already kind of, something that was against local people, because they had to operate in that context. When I came in, I was a complete foreigner. And so I was outside the system. So I think that already didn't give me extra automatic trust, but I didn't come with like a distrust automatically because of that. On top of that, too, I recognized that I was very young, and within any kind of healthcare field, there is a bit of a hierarchy with like doctors at the top, uh, and like public health government officials, and so I'm like, who am I as this like 19-year-old
Mm.
to say anything, right? I was like, and so there was that where I just was like, I'm a nobody here. I just want to do something, but I don't have any credentials. I don't have a background or a reputation. Uh, and then on top of that, too, the local people I actually worked with, uh, they are, this was the township of Mannenberg. They are very, very outspoken people. And so I was very lucky to just meet people that were like, once they had the right person in front of them, had a lot to say. Uh,
Mm.
and so I was almost like, I was actually shocked quite at the beginning, with how much people were telling me, like, do this, can you do that? Uh, and I was like, oh, cool. I was like, but what happened? I don't want to make the same mistakes that other people before have.
Mm.
And I, I was shocked to hear that their response would be like, no one's ever asked us about what
Oh
we
wow,
Wow.
do. Right. And I was like,
that's
right.
scary.
Right. And
Oh.
I was like, so why, like, what's the difference? Why are you telling me all this? It's like, because you asked, no one's ever really done that for us before. Uh, and so, yeah, that was what got people to actually talk. So it was a combination. I don't think it was like I came in with like the mindset being like, okay, cool, this is step one, step two, what I'm going to do. I didn't have that foresight at the time. It was just very lucky that I happened to be in the right situation and be in front of the right people for it to occur. And now, looking back over the past decade or two of my life, that was that was the secret. That was the secret sauce to get everything off the ground.
Could you tell us a bit more about the people or like the forum? Like if we could be in the room with you or those rooms, what does that look like? Where is it individual meetings with people asking them what they need or what their wishes are, or is it like in a group setting? Or can you walk us
Yeah.
through that a little bit?
Yeah, so I can tell you the experience that we had with the very, like when we first go into a community, whenever we try and, set up a version of our system, and then, versus later on, what occurs. The overarching theme is do what's right for the local area, the local people and context. And so when I first started in Mannenberg, and, technically when we go into any new site to try and set up our system, um, eventually we want to work with key individual people. Typically, they'll be community leaders of some sort. But to start off with is, we just asked. I literally just walked into Mannenberg, uh, which, you know, I didn't, people tell me that was extremely dangerous and reckless of me, which I do recognize now. But back then, I just had no idea. Um, I walk in and just started asking people, being like, just grab anybody. And, me being a foreigner, I look very different from the people there. Uh, it, People were curious to talk to me, uh, which worked out. And I just walked up to people like, hey, I heard that there are emergencies that occur in this area. And, there's this the emergency services aren't able to meet that demand. So I want to work with the right people to try and set up something. Who should I talk to? And you know, in these communities, the communities are everybody tends to know their neighbors. It's a much more tight knit than the neighborhoods that we come from. And so they would tell me like, oh, you need to work with this person or with these people, and so that would turn into like individual discussions. And typically those people are, the right people who will always then be guides for the rest of the process. But then sometimes they say like, we need to get other people involved. And that's when we can have like groups and then we sit down and talk with them. But at that point, then we kind of let the local people steer the conversation.
For context, just so we all kind of understand what ultimately the solution was that you were able to collaborate on, when an emergency happens now in one of these townships and you have this community-based response system, what does that look like, and where's kind of the community aspect coming in?
Right. So the when an emergency happens, it tends to be quite a community event, because everyone's living in close quarters with each other, knows each other on the street. Uh, Everyone knows, like, oh, this person has that skill, this person has that access to that, or that person may have like a car, so we can go to the hospital. And so, it's like an underutilized resource is having all these community members there, uh, standing around that want to help, but may not know how. So, you know, the step one was asking the local community people, like, hey, when an emergency happens, who should we empower with whatever the right skills are? And they're pretty good about identifying who needs to be involved. In one community, uh, it could be, mothers tend to be, at home. They're seen as like the caretakers of their family and the community. So we need to get all the mothers trained in first aid. In a different community, it might be like, hey, we have a very young population, and the kids are always the ones that are, up to mischief, and they end up being, causing emergencies and then being involved. So they need to be the ones that need to be trained. But we let them kind of steer that conversation. And then in terms of what we actually teach for first aid, again, that changes from community to community depending on what it is that their local local needs are. Uh, we, in one community, it might be more rural. They might be by water, so it's like drowning incidents that they need help with. In another place, it's more, it's by a freeway. Like, we have a lot of car accidents, so it's going to be much more trauma related. In other locations, like, hey, um, we got a very like elderly population, so we're looking at a lot more like heart attacks or strokes or confusion. Um, and then, once we set that up, how they actually respond is also dependent on what actually works for the local community. In some areas, it's very crowded, and so whenever any emergency happens, people can just run and grab their local community responder, and then they come and help, and then that person helps uh, assist with getting the patient, to the right medical care, or even handling the whole situation. In a much more rural area, people aren't close to each other. And on top of that too, the ambulances, they are also overstretched. They have to take care of a huge uh, landmass area. And so when an emergency occurs, uh, they have, the community members already be told beforehand, who to contact. And some areas might even have like a WhatsApp group so that they can message each other. And then from there, a community responder can go to the actual incident and then, call the ambulances and say like, hey, cool, like this, yeah, you need to prioritize this emergency. Uh, please come. Or, they can say like, don't worry about it. This was a mistake. Uh, uh, you don't actually need to come that quickly. And then like another example would be that if in an area that's like particularly that's typically affected by gang violence, uh, the community responders are there as, to go ahead of the ambulances to let them know, be like, yeah, it's safe for you to come, or be like, no, the shooting is still going on, just hold on before you come. But that's how the logistical operations of how that actually plays out does depend on what the local community.
I was just wondering what, like, when you're talking about the different people who need to know who is the local emergency responder to reach out to about an emergency, how do you get that information out to those people? If it's like the mothers in the community, or if it's the younger people or the kids? What are some ways that you kind of spread that information?
Yeah. So, I mean, in when we go into a community and we ask, like, who should we, who should be involved with the system, and they identify it. Uh, the In terms of recruiting or getting these people now involved, it also is very dependent on what the local community context. Um, Oftentimes they know, everyone in the community kind of knows each other. They can
Mm,
help each other correctly, or like there's the right forums for them to go through. Very popular in multiple communities is neighborhood watches, for example, right? So it's like, when we go in and be like, hey, we want to set up this community response system, uh, and they're like, oh, well, the neighborhood watches are perfect candidates for this because they're already people that when an emergency occurs, uh, they go and check in on things, and or people know to go to them, and so the neighborhood watches will already have like their own forums that we can uh, pitch to ask. Um, kind of like similar to that, if the in a lot of communities, the midwifery is a very very robust system that's already set up, and even though these are individuals who are more focused on labor and delivery for pregnant mothers. Um, for some reason, if there's an emergency, people are like, well, I don't know who else to go to, but this person's a healthcare person, so they go to them.
mm,
Right, and so that's when the community members would tell us, like, "Hey, why don't can we teach the midwives these basic first aid skills?" Uh, because people are coming to them and they're like, I know how to deliver a baby, but I'm not really sure how to mend a broken bone.
mm,
Yeah. It's interesting because I was kind of, especially when you brought up the kids, outside of, CPR training for kids who want to be babysitters, that's not usually the first person you think of in like our communities as,
mm-hmm,
first responders. So that's kind of an interesting example for me of something where if I heard that from a community representative, I probably would be a little surprised at first. It's not my initial assumption. So I was curious for you, were there any assumptions that you had or anything that they brought up where you were like, oh, that's interesting, or that's not what I expected, or something that you tried that didn't end up actually aligning with what they needed?
Yeah. I mean, multiple examples. I mean, one thing we've definitely learned is that there is no one size fits all for different communities. I mean, especially South Africa and the Western Cape province, which is Cape Town's province in general. It's a very heterogeneous population in terms of like culture, ethnicities, and so we've had to learn ourselves over and over again, or be taught over and over again to to really really listen to what's works best for a local area. So one example would be um, that in terms, like, even when we do the training, the at first, when we had no one else, uh, to do the training, I was doing a lot of the first aid training, at least for the first site for the first year, because I didn't have anyone else to do it. But then over time, I was like, hey, these people, they speak their own dialect. They trust their own people much better than outsiders. So we eventually set up. We eventually had local trainers to do the training, and once that happened, I'm kind of like, I step back and I track, the different community responders like performances, and saw performance rates go up in terms of their knowledge retention, their response rates. And so it was great. And I was like, okay, great. This is now a great model. Let's have local trainers. And then, but we go into a different community, and to them, they're like, hey, we actually want an authority figure. We want someone in a white coat with the title doctor to be doing
mm,
the thing, right? I was like, okay. I was like, this is so. It's like, what's right. What it was like, there is no single right. It's like, what works for the area, and we see this in other examples too, with in terms of the work that we're doing. So one thing I always find super interesting in terms of, like, again, back to who needs to be involved, who should be training. Um, the when I look at articles or research from other similar community response systems worldwide. It is, for some reason, everybody else, it's majority, like 70% plus male as their responders. It's a very male dominated dominated concept, I guess. But in our systems across all of the Western Cape Province in South Africa, it's flipped. It's all female, and I don't, and it's not like we're recruiting females specifically. It's just when we go into communities, we're like, who should we be training? And for some reason, it's vast majority female. And that's just what happens. That's not saying that we're doing anything specifically differently. It's just that's what works for South Africa, and or for the areas that we're operating in. So we go with it.
Interesting. You bringing up kind of community-based systems worldwide reminds me of one of our questions, and Bella, feel free to expand on this because I know that you brought this up as well, was the idea of a community-based system sounds great. It's like, of course, if you have local people working as part of the emergency response system, then it is going to more likely be more catered to the needs of the people there. And so from your perspective, what are other examples of these kinds of community-based systems? And is this something that we expect could work in other contexts, maybe more similar to ours, somewhere in the US, or is this something that, is a solution that's specific to certain contexts that you are working within?
Right. So I think, so in terms of what we've been doing is setting up community members as part of the emergency response system. And that is, that's been successful in the communities that we've been operating in. But I do want to acknowledge that it's not a solution for everyone or everywhere. It's when we don't want to roll into a community and say like, hey, cool, we have a solution here, take it.
Mm-hmm.
We wait for the communities to kind of avail themselves and say like, hey, this is something that we think can work here. What we do also get involved in is, when we're trying to improve emergency services in different communities, we want to recognize that community responders may not be the solution. So we don't want to, so we're kind of like balancing between saying like, okay, we're very good at establishing community members as community responders, but our ultimate goal is to create a system that is community based, and that might mean we don't necessarily need more neighbors having life support skills. It may involve that we need more ambulances, or the system that already exists there just needs extra support for what they already have. The community members are just an additional resource or tool that we can, or a group of people that we can lean on if it's helpful. But we don't want to say that that's like the actual solution for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would you ever see a system like this, or at least like aspects of it, or like learnings from it? Could you see that being applied in the US, or I want to say
Yeah.
Sweden, but maybe, yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, no, you'd be surprised. So again, like I mean, you could probably hear the hesitation in my voice. I don't want to say like, oh yeah, we found it, we're gonna everybody do
Oh
it.
no, of course not. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right. And I say like, what we're doing is we feel like is working for the areas that we're operating in, and both we bring it to areas that we think it's gonna work, and also once we're there, we're like, okay, we're gonna make this work for you. That being said, I am quite impressed at how far reaching this community responder model does reach. And it's I keep in touch with people who are doing similar things in Haiti or Kenya or Sierra Leone, but then I also see examples of this happening in like Scotland, or I think there might even Norway had like an example of this occurring. And in America, because it's so huge, there are plenty of examples of like neighborhood volunteer first responder systems.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm also thinking about here in Sweden with specifically with underserved communities that are maybe a bit skeptical toward systems that haven't served them and haven't had them in mind when being designed. And um yeah, my thoughts just kind of go that way to, yeah, it would be interesting to see how it's like applied in different concepts or
Right.
yeah, contexts.
And you get pretty innovative too. So I know, like, here we've been, so far we've been focusing a lot on South Africa, but when you go across different contexts, the how it manifests can definitely change based on what works for the people. I've seen example. I don't think it's still working at the moment, but I remember maybe over a decade ago, I saw an example of someone working uh, on drones that could deliver AEDs
Mm.
in the Netherlands, right? And so the idea was like, hey, this is, as opposed to sending a community responder out, any person can instantly be activated as a first responder, and a drone's going to deliver an AED to that site, and then we'll have voice instructions to the person on how to apply it and use it. But that's just like, that's like really thinking outside of the
Yeah.
box.
Yeah, it reminds me of that podcast that you sent, Bella, a few years ago, and it was, I forget the doctor's name. We'll find the podcast and add in the information later. But
Oh, it was
essentially,
Doug Eby, I think his name was.
EB. Okay,
Eby,
yeah.
yeah, Doug Eby.
So he did work with preventative care in Alaska, actually, in the native communities there. And similar kind of approach where he, instead of having the government come in and say, this is how your medical system is going to work, and have, specialists be separated out from kind of your basic, like, general care, what he did was he brought the community together and he said, okay, well, how can we actually make this a system that works and make people feel more connected to the providers, make it easier to get to specialists? And the health outcomes were incredible. I mean, I think it went from like the 5th percentile in terms of health outcome up to like 70th percentile. I will double check all these numbers. But the basis of that, I think at this point, was that coming in and having this, the approach that he took was having basically a forum of these patient representatives, which was just locals from the community saying, this is what we need and this is how we like to work, was what resulted in them being able to implement a system that actually worked. And so I think, like, at the core of what you're saying, Jared, it's the same thing. It's going in, and yes, it's not one size fits all, but the one thing that is consistent is that you're going in and you're listening to the people that are there.
Yeah, and exactly to your point too. That's something that we're, in the example you just gave, that we're dealing with as well too. Because we have to be adaptive to what the local needs and context and people actually are. So, for example, we started out uh, being like, we're going to set up emergency responders, or we're going to help support the emergency response system. When we actually look, years later now, look at how the system's being used, uh, a, a tremendous amount of people actually use the emergency response system for their primary care.
Mm.
Not just, like we see, even here in the US, I see that, people use the emergency room as primary care, for, or urgent care. But, now people, but there's people, right? There are people in South Africa. People were calling the emergency response system, ambulances, or our emergent community emergency responders, uh, for primary care issues. Like, help me with this bandage dressing, or
Mm.
I go see next, or like, hey, do you have the flu or the COVID vaccine, right? And I remember, like, when we started realizing this, and people were saying, like, hey, this is an abuse of the system. we need to handle emergencies. This is our focus, which is understandable. But then there was also the argument that, hey, this is the reality. This is what people are using the system for. If we're going to be patient-centered, a lot of the patients calling for the emergency, maybe it's not necessarily an abuse of the system. To them, healthcare is healthcare. So it makes complete sense.
Right.
Call someone, I need help, and I call someone, doesn't matter if it's an emergency or not, and they don't even aren't able to tell if it's an emergency or not because they're not a healthcare provider. And
Definitely.
we need to work with the local area and how it's actually being used. And so, now we're trying to help our system be able to be equipped to handle that. Where they are providing primary care somewhat, or at least integrating better with like the local areas primary care system. And it's just that realization being like, you have to meet the actually meet the context and the people with what you're trying to do, because it's if you have to like understand what the reality is and adjust accordingly.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting example of like how, like, I don't think gatekeeping is the right word, but that I think we learn what an emergency is or not when we're like in elementary school. And then there's no really like, you don't learn about what do you learn? Like, oh, if there's a fire, if someone is sick, but in that moment of like, I don't know enough about, like, I'm not a doctor or a nurse, like I need help with something, but I don't know who to talk to, then like vilifying that like outreach of, hey, I need help is that's a shame that it would have to work like that. And you would see it from the perspective that you were talking about, that you don't want people to feel like, or you don't want to take that as like them abusing the system, because that's not done with intention.
Yeah, I
People
mean,
just need help.
yeah, and that's a recurrent theme. Even practicing emergency medicine in Los Angeles. It, I think the emergency room is an interesting place because if the rest of society doesn't know what else to do with an individual, go to the emergency room
Yeah.
and let them
Exactly.
let them figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, to be honest, it is refreshing to see a doctor hear that. And I know you're not a proponent of people going to the ER or urgent care for everyday things, but I have gotten many slaps on the wrist. So I'm just like, listen, sometimes getting a PCP is hard. So,
No,
uh,
I don't want to blame. I don't want to blame. I don't want to blame patients. I don't. It's a system. It's a system-wide issue, right? It was like, a lot of people, they don't have access to their primary care doctor. They don't have healthcare access. Otherwise, I have this conversation frequently with my patients where they're like, hey, look, I'm sorry. I know this isn't an emergency, but I just have nowhere else to go. It's like I understand. Um, and then also now with emergency medicine residency, they are teaching a lot more like low acuity primary care kind of issues, because also even American healthcare is coming to grips with being like, a lot of people are showing up with these issues. I remember when I was doing my residency, I'm learning how to do like chest compressions, like central lines, like stop the bleeding, and like very, very, very like extreme stuff. And then I start working on my own in a clinic, and someone comes up to me and be like, "Oh yeah, like I stubbed my toe, and now it's like my toenail's all blue." And I was like, "Okay, I don't." Right? I was like,
What do
"Why?"
you
Don't,
do with this?
I was like, "I think you need an
Absolutely.
amputation, but I don't know what to. Yeah, I don't know what to do about
you're Googling on the side.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
no,
that's interesting.
but it's interesting to also hear that the system even here is starting to adapt a little bit to that, like seeing that behavior and then saying, okay, well, I mean, if this is the reality of what patients are doing here, then how can we also equip our doctors to have, because like you're saying, I mean, if you're vilifying patients, then ultimately you're just kind of brushing the actual issue. There's no band-aid solution that you can kind of put on that. So, and I wanted to ask also, just to kind of put a ribbon on our conversation around like the community-based response system in South Africa, in terms of the outcomes that you saw there and the results of your work there compared to when you started 10 years ago. Like what are some of the impacts that you saw by implementing this kind of more
Very,
local
yeah,
need-based systems?
very. We've seen some really amazing things, and amazing things in very unexpected ways. Uh, when we when we started, and I want to emphasize we. This was like a huge team of individuals. I think I was the one who just first like press the start button, but it's like a huge team of people that were constantly learning from each other and just like learning on the job. But when we first started, obviously we were hyper focused on emergencies and saving lives, morbidity, mortality, this stuff that very typical and very narrow minded. Um, in terms of tracking the benefit to people's life and well-being, it is in an area like South Africa, the Western Cape Province, data keeping is quite difficult. So it's very hard to track that, but anecdotally and or qualitatively, we do get reports that there's a lot of benefit to people's lives and well-being from an emergency medical standpoint. Um, Now looking back 15 years later, uh, the other benefits that came out of the woodwork was things that I never expected though. So one example is that by setting up a community response system, uh, a lot of the local people felt like they were being given more ownership and control over their areas. And so we have gotten reports that they feel safer because people now have more agency and they know who to help and they know who can help them in those situations. Uh, Additionally, too, ambulances have reported back to us saying that uh, response times are quicker because local responders are able to communicate with them and one help them logistically get to an area or they can help assist. They could also report back to them saying that like, hey, this emergency needs to be prioritized or this one can be deprioritized. And so the ambulances are now much more focused to know like which one they need to get to quicker. And then the ambulances also report to us like when they show up, uh, they even just like feel safer because they recognize who the community responders are and just having a familiar face in the sea of people that you don't know or are they there to hurt you? Are they there to take advantage of the situation? Helps them out more. So it's been helping the rest of the system operate even better, which is something that we didn't anticipate for. On top of that, too, there's been general development benefits from this sort of system. So what we didn't expect or what we didn't even plan for was that by starting this response system in different communities, we were jump starting a lot of people's career progression. They would become responders, and then from there, because they finally had a way to start, we have lots of responders that have gone on to become nurses. We have gone responders to go on to be educators. And I think there's even a police officer. We also have a handful uh, of community responders that have gone on to become paramedics. Uh, and you know, a lot of them, actually go back to the community that they are from and serve as paramedics there. And so it further just strengthens the system. So, you know, we went in starting with just, hey, let's save lives, from a medical standpoint. Um, but we're, just slowly really opening our eyes that, this had a lot of other effects, across the whole community. And we're still trying to document and figure out, what the extent of this is.
Oh. No, that's amazing to kind of hear the impact that that's had and hearing about how sustainable your solution is. I think that's what is really inspiring from like a design standpoint, and the fact that you were able to collaborate with the community in order to actually create something that, like you said at the beginning, didn't require this external, like anyone from the outside to kind of stay there and keep it running. It is something that then the local community can take and run with and develop themselves, and improve both psychological impacts, but then also obviously from like the system perspective too. And yeah, it's
Yeah, and I would say definitely our most successful, active, robust communities that community sites are the ones where they have transitioned from the initial phase of like, hey, we're here to help, and we set it up, to really, them taking over. So we have it's just it's so inspiring, when we hit that moment in a community where, you know, one or a couple or a few champions really stand up and be like, this is, we're gonna take control, we're gonna make this ours, and they really take the system in directions that we didn't even anticipate, but it's the right direction for them, and it's a direction that we didn't even know, because we're not from that community. We don't know the details and the context of the neighborhood, as well as the people who actually live there. So it's really refreshing when people who actually live there take over, versus us from the outside trying to set something.
Mm.
I love that, at the end of the day, it all comes back to having that same sort of mentality that you had at 19, where it's like, who am I to tell these people what
Yeah.
to do? Right.
Let's go back
Like,
to that.
yeah, ironically, you're like, there's a hierarchy, of course, in medicine. And, there's uh, obviously a lot of respect and knowledge that comes with having more years of experience. But then at the same time, it's like you don't want to lose also that same kind of fresh mindset that you had when you were just starting out, right? So
Yeah, I mean, and still to this day, I really am like trying to be like, hey, look, I'm an outsider, respectfully. Like, I should not be at the forefront. I should not be at the helm. I get Um, I get pretty anxious when I see a lot of, global health or development, nonprofits, and there's a foreigner like in the dead center.
Mm.
Driving. I was like, this is not, that worries me. And I was like, because this is, in order for this really to be successful, uh, both, in terms of what's right and what is going to be operationally successful, this needs to be owned, managed, and guided by the people who are actually going to be using it. Um, and when I'm back in South Africa, oftentimes, I get invited to a lot of like our organizations, like community events, and I I I I go to them a bit nervous, because I show up, and then, they're like, oh, he's here, Dr. So and so, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, get really, really nervous. I was like, guys, it's not about me. I'm not even the one who's like doing a lot of the heavy lifting nowadays. Uh, but I still go because, I want to acknowledge them and not seem like, I'm being like, too much of a big deal to even show up to their events. So I like kind of like, okay, yes, I'll like very cursory be like, okay, good, I'm here. I acknowledge you. Thank you. Thank you. Like,
yeah.
you really don't,
Mm.
you really don't have to call me Dr. Sun. Like, okay.
Yeah, there's a fine line to walk there for sure. It kind of gets at what we touched on in the first episode of like as designers in any context. I mean, when you have a seat at the decision making table, and obviously you have a seat as a doctor, but then also as a designer, like co-designing this sort of response system, is you are in those kinds of contexts still a representative for the patients or the users, and like you said, it's not about you, right? And so I think that's a really good takeaway to have. And
Yeah, I
I
think one of the biggest, I mean, like, I would say that if I were to, I guess, describe my leadership style for this particular organization over the past several years, it I think the best use of my power, uh, it was is to elevate the voices of the people I work with and of the community people. So it's basically telling myself and other people who may be a little bit too authoritative to shut up, uh, and
Yes.
let the actual
Yeah.
let the actual community members or the people who are running the emergency response system day to day to give their insights, give their guidance, give their wisdom, and give their ownership. And this, um, I, eventually, a lot of this work that I was doing here in South Africa turned into a PhD thesis at the University of Cape Town. But across 120 pages, if I could summarize my PhD in one sentence, it's shut up and listen.
Literally, same design philosophy. I completely agree with that. Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, that's how we get solutions like what you have in South Africa right now, where they are sustainable and they are catered to local needs. So, yeah, that's really refreshing to hear also.
Definitely.
But yeah, I think we might have covered everything that we kind of wanted to talk about. That was amazing, Jared,
Yeah.
by the way.
Oh, that was super
That
interesting.
was
Thank
so
you,
good.
Jared. Yeah.
The only question that we had left, which
Yes.
depends on how much time you have,
I
is
have time going.
okay. Bella, do you want to?
Yeah, I asked this also as the child of a nurse who worked in a couple of different um, departments, but in when we lived in New Jersey, I remember like uh, like a childhood memory was sitting at the dinner table and my mom asking like, guess what I found inside of somebody today, like that kind of. So my question to you is, what's the craziest thing you've seen working in the ER?
Oh, wow. So many stories to tell. I can't get too specific on things because of patient privacy. I guess
Of course, of
let me
course.
just okay, let me just say this then. It was like the worst the worst day of the year to work in the emergency room is 4th of July. Just like hands down.
Oh, oh
I
no.
I don't know who thought it would be a great idea to combine fireworks and booze on a
Oh,
No.
the founding fathers.
yeah,
They were.
yeah. So
Oh
but
no.
I was we got it's yeah, 4th of July is in a month. So if anyone who listens to this before that, just please be careful. It is on top of that too, combining it with that the July 1st is when all the new medical graduates are starting.
I
So
heard about
Oh,
this. Yeah.
I did not know about this.
Yeah, don't
So
get
they
sick in
get
July.
yeah, so yeah,
Don't do it.
so new inexperienced doctors,
Oh no.
alcohol, and fireworks. Just please be careful this 4th of July.
Well,
Yeah.
PSA, you heard it here first.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're clipping first out of this entire
Yay.
podcast.
Oh man.
But yeah, no, I can
That's
imagine
great.
you. That's some gnarly stuff. But yeah, cool. Well, is there anything else from your end, Jared, that you wanted to touch on or we didn't get to?
No, I mean whatever you guys need from me. Otherwise, I really enjoyed speaking with the both of you, and I hope you and your listeners go out there and design things to make community members' lives better and make my life easier as well too. So please go for
It's
it.
a win-win.
Yeah.
Love that.
That was awesome. This should be
That
a
was really
recap. Us
good.
just being like, good job. Good job.
I was so nervous.
Me too. I was super nervous. I had like a bit of an out of body experience where like I was just like, why am I so nervous right now? Like what this feels like it felt like a mix of like being in a really high stakes meeting with like a job interview. And I was just like, this is this is so weird. Like, why do I feel
I
this
know.
way?
I was like, what is, like, in my brain, what is the worst possible outcome of this? Like, why am I so nervous? Like you said, it feels like a job interview, and it's like, I'm not, who's interviewing who?
Yeah, exactly. No, it was crazy. But I think it ended up being really good. And like, I love the way that Jared's like way of thinking about like putting the patient in the center and putting the communities that you're serving as a healthcare professional in the center. It really touched on some design principles that I think both of us have strived for in our work. But I loved, first of all, that they didn't just see this issue and just like, let's throw some like tech at it. Like, I love that it just the like humility aspect of walking in there and being like, listen, I'm just here to collect like your wants and needs and wishes. I'm not here to like solve a problem necessarily, like you're gonna solve the problem, but I'm going to ask the questions that help you solve it. It reminds me of the thing, I don't know if you heard about this or if you were living here in Sweden at the time, but when Boston Consulting Group, and I'm gonna double check that it was them, but I'm pretty sure, came in and like redid the Karolinska Hospital here, like the university hospital. So they came in as a consulting group, and we're, I mean, the designers are going to be the designers of this new hospital, and like the way healthcare workers moved around, the way things would be stored, the way um, departments were organized, that was like something that this consulting firm was going to design for this new high-tech hospital. It was going to be the most like high-tech, most advanced hospital in Sweden. And they completely botched it because just completely messed everything up. And there's like, we can maybe link to some, like, I'm sure there's tons of articles, and I know there's like podcasts about what happened and what went wrong and everything. But I think like at the end of the day, their big fault was not going in with that mindset that Jared was talking about, and being like, let's be humble about this. Like, we're only here to like help people express their wants and needs when working as healthcare providers. They went in and were like, we know exactly how to fix this, and we're going to do this, and it's just going to be different, but it's going to be good. And it was complete chaos, like nothing worked. So I really appreciate how much time he spent on that part.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, I mean, that's such a key part of it, in the sense of, it's not even us saying this from a perspective of like, that's just the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, but also from an outcome perspective, from a practical perspective, as Jared said, there's other examples where they tried to do this in communities and it didn't work because there was this approach of, we're going to go in and we're going to tell you what to do. And exactly the same thing as you're saying with Boston Consulting and Karolinska. And it's just like, it doesn't end up being sustainable. So if you want to waste your time and money investing in something that there's a very good chance it's not going to work for the needs of the local people there. Again, it might work in another context, but it's not a one size fits all kind of thing where you just lift and shift solutions. Then that is the better approach to take. And I think that sometimes when we get to a place where we either have a lot of experience or we've been put into a role where we're expected to make the decisions and be the leader of whatever design project we're working on, we might feel like, oh, we have something to prove. And so therefore we're supposed to come in with the answers, but that's just not true. And it's like someone who actually has a good sense of the design process knows that at the beginning you really want to keep your mind open, and you want to just step back a little bit and you want to listen. And so that's why it was like refreshing to hear that Jared came in as this 18, 19-year-old, which is crazy now comparing to like the way he talks about it and everything that he was able to do there, obviously together with the team. But it just goes to show, like, starting out with that really fresh mindset is what ultimately is going to help you help the people there in the best possible way.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I really like that he brought up was that example of like people starting to use those emergency systems as their primary care and like seek care in that way, and then but then them like as a team like not vilifying that or seeing that as abuse of the system that they've created, because a design can be such a living thing. Like you'll never really know what the outcome of a design that you put into the world is. It'll like take on a life of its own, and you just kind of have to be flexible with that and not see it as like, okay, well, you're using it wrong. That's not. And just the thing of like, especially in healthcare, of seeing or designing for like the perfect patient, designing for somebody who definitely knows what an emergency is and what is go see your like family doctor on Monday situation, like can differentiate between those. I think that was also a really interesting point he brought up.
100%. Yeah. And it's funny because I did resonate with that a lot too. I was like, it's it is the system, in the sense of, like, even for me, if I could go to my regular doctor and I didn't have to wait months for it, I would, but I can't. So it's like, what am I going to wait to get care? No. And like you said, like, as opposed to giving a slap on the wrist to instead be like, well, if this is the best solution, like, at the end of the day, you want to help people, you want to make sure that people
Right.
get the care that they need. So I think, yeah, I loved his point about that kind of open-mindedness too, about letting the solution develop, and what he was saying about, like, when communities take over these systems
Mm,
too, and they take it in their own direction, and it's not anything that he envisioned for it,
mm-hmm,
but it's the right direction because it's what they need. I love that thinking, where it's
mm,
like, it really is the solution is your users or your patients. It's their ownership. It's they're the owners of the solution at the end of the day. So yeah, I really love that
definitely.
point as well.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, empowering them to just make choices that are different but better for themselves. Like that's ultimately like what you want to leave behind.
Also, I liked what he was saying about you know, a lot of it does come down to luck. There is no kind of, single approach that's going to
Mm,
be a kind of a guarantee as far as working and co-designing with users. And I think that ultimately there are design processes that we follow, and it is important to have consistency across the processes that we use. However, I think the takeaway for me there was that staying adaptable, not only in where your solution is going to be, but also how you work with people, is so
mm,
important. So it's like the research methods that you use with people, whether it's, that panel in with the work that Dr. Eve, what
EB?
was his
Yeah.
first name? Eby, Dr. Eby was doing in Alaska, or doing these kinds of like on the ground, just talking to people, interviews that Jared was doing in Manenberg initially. It's you're going to have to cater the process and the research methods you use for your communities as well. So that was another kind of important takeaway, I think, for me, is like, I
Mm-hmm.
think, again, you don't want to get too stuck also in, okay, well, let me go in and let me do these interviews and let me
Yeah,
do it this way or whatever, So, yeah.
definitely. I think like an everyday work example of that flexibility. I think it's a really good point that you're bringing up is like exactly how hard you want to stick to your usability test script. Like be open to other things coming up. Like if I've had usability tests where I mean, it's a fine line too, of course. You also have to definitely like gauge certain things in the interview, but if a certain aspect of a design comes up, or a certain concern or just detail of their like use context comes up and it wasn't necessarily part of the script, then just kind of like roll with it and see where that takes you, because that might lead you down to the right solution that's most effective.
100%. And it's all kind of coming back to just like decentering yourself from the process and from the solution. And of course, like there is a reason why we have designers as part of this, of course, at the end of the day. But I think really seeing yourself as a vessel is such a strong word, but I think it's because I've been watching Stranger Things, as a vessel for the needs and how they translate into the solution, rather than any sort of coming in and knowing the answers from the get-go, despite whatever kind of previous experience you've had. So yeah, definitely. It was really a really interesting conversation. So
when you hear the word vessel, do you think of like a ship, or do you think of like a container, like a water bottle?
Well, right now I think of a container because I've been watching Stranger Things.
It changes.
But yeah, but I guess vessel usually, well, I guess it depends on context. In this context, I'm using it as a container.
Yeah, I always think of it as a container, so I'm with you there. But
really?
I just realized, yeah.
Interesting. Well,
so we know that. Now we know that. I said it and I meant it.